that was quite an introduction, Jayamit. Thanks a lot for having me here. Really, really appreciate it. Um, I'd just like to start by saying that I have just crossed 40, so I'm no longer in that 40 under 40 list. I think I had my midlife crisis at 40 and decided that I'm never going to work for a corporate multinational brand ever again and go down my entrepreneurial journey. The topic that I'm going to talk to you about today is something that I truly believe is the single hottest, biggest, most exciting opportunity on the internet in India, and that is local languages. And it's really around how local languages are redefining the landscape of digital India. Now, one thing that I'll disclaim here is do not think of this as an internet or an app or any presentation which is focused on technology. This is a discussion around Bharat. And what I'll say is no matter what business you are in, you could be in the business of oil and gas, pharma, consumer electronics, OEMs with mobile phones, telecom, banking and financial services. No matter what business you are in, this is going to impact your business in the next 3 to 4 years like you have never thought about it before. There is a sea change happening in India's internet revolution, and I'm just going to talk to you about that over the next 15 to 20 minutes. So let me start by saying that, Nelson Mandela once said that if you speak to a man in a language he understands, it goes to his head. But if you speak to him in his language, it goes to his heart. And this is the very foundation or the very philosophy that's going to govern the internet and businesses over the next couple of years as we go forward. So the way I've organized my section is I'm going to introduce India and Indian languages a little bit here, just as a refresher for a whole bunch of us in the room. We are victims of our colonial Victorian heritage, and so it's a good refresher to just see what diversity we have. I'm going to superimpose that with economic growth and how does that really play in terms of what's going to happen in the consumer sector. Talk about the mobile and internet revolution and more futuristic because we already know about what's happening right now. And then pivot over to talk about how the marketing and the advertising landscape in the country is actually going to pivot in terms of the ad opportunity. And towards the end, over 5 minutes, I'll give you some interesting statistics about the work that we're doing at Daily Hunt and the mission that we are on. So let me start off with saying this. India is the oldest civilization and the youngest nation. Our biggest boon is our demographic dividend with the median age of 27. And the interesting part about India, the way I look at it is so diverse, right? A fun fact is we are a millionaire in a country of gods. We worship over 2 million gods in this country. There are 22 plus primary languages, over 1,600 plus dialects. But when you have to superimpose that as to how do you really look at India, I tend to look at it as Europe. You pass through 20 different countries in Europe. There are 30 plus states in the country. Every time you pass through a country, the language changes, the religion changes, the culture changes, the food changes. And that is really a representation of India, right? It is every state has its own unique, distinct culture, religion, and language. And as our history states, we're a culture that celebrates diversity, right? But that's a little bit about the past. And when you think about India, there's a massive regional population whose speakers of Indian languages actually exceed the population of some of the largest developed countries in the world. And the GDP that is coming out of the regions from where they speak these local languages is actually greater than some of the most prosperous countries in the world, right? Let's take, for example, English is spoken natively by 0.03% Indians. That's it. There is 10% of India that understands and communicates in English. That's 120 million Indians. 90% of India, and I'll refer to it as Bharat from this point on in the presentation, is regional language audiences. Hindi. Hindi has 521 million consumers who speak and communicate and understand Hindi. That's greater than the population of the US, UK, and Japan combined. The GDP just coming out of the Hindi heartlands, right? And you can say that they're the economically backward part of India, is still greater than that of Indonesia. If you take the South Indian languages, which is Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, and Kannada, that's about 250 million people, right? And the GDP coming out of that part of the world is greater than that of a pretty prosperous country like UAE, right? Marathi and Gujarati, 150 million people, right? Oriya and Bengali, another 100 million people. So when you think about India, the fallacy that Angrezi is the bhasha of the country is what is a representation of this room, which is tier 1 India, right? And I think we're the tier 1 ka tier 1 elite, right? We're really at the top of the pyramid. But that's not a reflection of Bharat, right? And somewhere there is this other reflection that we have in our minds, जो अपनी local भाषा बोलता है, वो गरीब आदमी है. You know, the guy who does not speak English, we tend to judge him or her with different lenses. And I'll tell you an interesting anecdote on this slide. I was on a flight, an Indigo flight, and a lot of us who fly Indigo sit on the 13th row, right? We ask for that additional legroom seat, and we pay 600 rupees for the seat. And if your office books a meal for you, they pay 500 rupees for a meal. And typically when you're on that seat, you'll see people like us, right? I mean, with a shirt, pant, coat, whatever, right? Corporate, working, doing a startup, you know, in this line of work. So I got into this flight, and this is probably my 200th Indigo flight, and I'm sitting next to two people who look different, who are dressed differently, and I can make out they don't speak a word of English, because when the lady came to brief them on the security protocol, they opted for Hindi, right? Now, my first thought that went into my mind, this is the bias that existed in my mind after doing what I'm doing at Daily Hunt, was that this is probably somebody's help, which is flying, right? You help in your household, you're flying them to another location. Then I started thinking, and I was watching their behavior. They were watching movies on their phone, and they had their headphones on, right? When the lady came for serving the food, they had a pre-booked meal as well. And they had the same masala chai and veg sandwich that I ordered. Now that's got me thinking to say, this can't be somebody's help as to why would I spend 600 rupees for a seat and 500 rupees for a meal? Something's not right. So I started talking to them. And what I realized was one of them was the largest distributor in the north of India for United Phosphorus. He probably had more money than a lot of us in this room individually. And another one ran a very successful printing press in Daryaganj. And I walked over up front to the leading lady, you know, the lady with the badge who was sitting in front, and I put this disclaimer. I said, listen, I'm really here to talk to you. I'm not I'm not trying to get fresh, but I really want to learn from you. And I said, tell me, when you get into a flight, why do you say, is flight ke sare karamchari Hindi, Angrezi, Tamil, Telugu, or Nepali bol sakte hain? She was like, you know, the bias is in your mind, sir. Because when we speak in our local language, almost 60% of all sales for food, beverage, and shopping in a flight happens in local language. It's your bias that a local language consumer does not have the purchasing power parity to pay. In fact, if they like that box of choda, they'll take 5 of them for their family, right? That's the kind of environment that they work in. So I think that's one thing that I will encourage you to think about is, our own history and heritage around language does not determine our socio-economic parameter to consume, and that's a big learning for me over the years. Now, here's an interesting dichotomy, okay? So we talked about the bias that exists in the room. I saw a lot of people smile, so they agreed with me, hopefully. But if you look at media today, regional media, which is non-English, actually dominates all forms of media. So 90% of all content on TV is non-English. 86% of all advertising on TV is non-English. 85% of all content on newspapers is non-English, and 65% of all ad spend in India in newspapers is non-English. 17 of the top 20 newspapers are non-English, they're regional language newspapers. And all 10 of the top 10 TV channels are non-English channels, right? The TRP rating for a Coffee with Karan on an English show may be higher for one given show, but at an aggregate level, regional languages dominate. And why is that the case? Hypothetically, when you put an ad on television across, let's say, all 1,000 channels, it gives you a reach of 810 million Indians. And marketeers and business leaders like yourself who run those campaigns on TV automatically opt for a Hindi or a regional language that you're targeting because your audience is there. Now, the internet is not here, but in the next 3 years is going to shape and get there, and I'll talk to you about that. So let's just talk about the economic overlay of this, right, in terms of where we are. When you think about India, and there was a reference to 1.3 billion people, the actual consuming class today in the country is about 250, 300 million Indians, right? The rest of us have a GDP per capita of around $1,000 to $2,000, right? And so we're really not large consuming nations. Now, it's predicted by World Bank that at the rate of 7.6 to 8% growth that we're experiencing in the next 10 years, we'll move from being the 6th largest economy in the world from $2.6 trillion to the third largest economy in the world with over $8.6 trillion in real GDP by 2028. By that time, GDP per capita is going to move closer to the $4,000 to $5,000 mark, right? Which is when the rest of Bharat actually becomes real consumers. We're already seeing a lot of consumption happen in tier 2, tier 3 India. In fact, all of Amazon, all of Flipkart, if you see their sales, 70% of it is coming from beyond India. In fact, and Amazon is a really smart marketer, right? They're talking about aur dikhao, India ki dukaan, Amazon wale, right? And that's not being done just to be Indian. That's because growth in sales is actually coming from those regions in those languages, right? But I think this is the exciting part, that if you believe we are a non-consuming market, my belief is in the next 10 years, we will be driving greater consumption, just like what we saw in China happen in China 10 years ago, right? Now, these numbers are out there in terms of what's driving consumption, but the startling one for me is mobile, right? There are 1.1 billion SIM cards in a country of 1.3 billion people. And what that tells you is that the very basic essentials of life, which is roti, kapda, or makan, is being transformed to roti, kapda, makan, and mobile, right? Any guess on which was the single largest owned commodity by an Indian pre-mobile? What do you think it was? 90% of you have it on you right now. Sorry? Shout it out? No. Watch. It was a wristwatch. It was a wristwatch. And that again was around 300 to 400 million in terms of number. But when you think about what's driving this revolution, we're a country with no more than 50 million PCs. So we have leapfrogged the entire PC era. And I'm going to contrast this across 5 or 6 markets and bring it back to language in a minute, right? So let's look at the mobile phone landscape. There are about 400 million smartphones today in India. There are about 450 to 500 million feature phones in the country. Feature phones are the old phones which you just had a keypad on, right? Now, post-Jio, there's this movement of feature phones becoming smart, right? And they've launched a new feature phone market. But we're the largest feature phone market in the world. The smartphone market is growing by about 40% year on year in India. It's the largest smartphone consuming market in the country today. Now, the implication of this is very interesting because when you think about what's the average time frame, do you know that an Indian changes his mobile phone device? Take a guess. Very close. It's about 13 months. That's the average. So there's a huge market for trade in and trade out, which is what we all do when we sell our phones and graduate to new ones. And there's a lot of conversion happening over the next 3 years. Now, this is important. Don't try and read this slide. It's a cluster of too much information, but I'll try and contextualize this for you. So if you remember in 2005, I was in Bombay. There was an offer which came from Reliance Communications. It was called Monsoon Hangama, where you got a Reliance phone for 100 rupees with free incoming for life. And there were these lines that got formed outside stores in Mumbai. That was the point at which India became the lowest voice calling market in the world. We became the cheapest market in the world for voice calls. Now that's happened thanks to Jio and the Jio effect with all the other operators following suit on data. Data is now $0.02 a GB, right? Think about it. I charge you 100 rupees a month or 150 rupees a month, and I give you 1 or 1.5 GB a day, right? Now, what's happening is there was an interesting data point earlier around the number of television sets in this country. There were 180 million television sets in a country of 1.3 billion people, but then media companies say that the reach of TV is 810 million. How is that possible? That's because, the argument is we congregate as families and watch TV. How many of those TVs do you think are cathode ray tube versus flat panel? Throw me a number, percentage. So there are 180 million TVs in India. I'm just trying to break some myths in this room, right? That we don't understand Bharat. If this room thinks we understand Bharat just because we speak to someone in Hindi or English, we don't understand Bharat. But Bharat is very different. How many TVs of the 180 million TVs that are there in India are cathode ray tube versus flat panel? About 60%, right? And that is amazing. So what that tells you is the mobile is turning into a device for consumption, for entertainment. Recently, when I moved back, I was in Gurgaon for 2 years when I was running Facebook, and I moved back to my hometown in Bangalore. We went to our home and we were looking for a domestic help. The domestic help came over and started, she thought that we were expats who were coming from the US because we moved to an area where there were lots of expats. And so she was highballing the number in terms of negotiating with my wife. And I was listening to this conversation. And the interesting part about that conversation was she agreed to my wife's price, but she said, when I come to your house, it's going to take me 3-4 hours while I'm here. I want access to your internet router, right? And I was like, done. I just walked into the room and it said, done, give her the password. I was just curious to see what she was doing. What she would do is come home every day, and she had a Jio phone. So I was again curious, 1 GB of data is a lot of data. What is this girl doing? She'd come home with a smartphone, but she had 3 or 4 SD cards, and she would download movies. And that was her dose of entertainment for the weekend, because they didn't have a TV at home. It was a single TV household where the in-laws and the family got to watch what had a preference. As a woman, she didn't. But that just told me that the mobile has kind of democratized everything, right? Think about it. There are, post-launch of Jio, the smart feature phone is now 1,500 rupees. Smartphones are now down to sub 5,000 rupee levels, right? We are the cheapest data market in the world, and smartphone shipments year on year is 150 million. The implication of this is that today there are 409 million people on the internet in India. In the next 3 years, that number is going to go to 800 million, right? But 710 million of them will access the internet through mobile phones, because that's the shipment that's going to happen of the conversion of feature phones to smartphones. Now, the biggest implication of this is in India, the mobile is the internet and the internet is mobile. I don't know how many of you, a lot of you are in finance, so I shouldn't say that, but I don't virtually open my laptop at all. I don't need to, because everything happens on a mobile phone for me, right? But interestingly, we're also the largest mobile data consuming market in the world. Now, this number is a little misleading because Jio popularized this number, but I'll contextualize it. So we consume about 1.5 to 2 billion GB a month of data, mobile data, whereas the US and China are less than half or half of our size. But in US and China, there is a very large Wi-Fi infrastructure. So a lot of the consumption is not happening on mobile data, but is happening on Wi-Fi, because they went through the PC era, which we have not gone through. So we've completely leapfrogged into the mobile era, right? Here's where the numbers get really interesting, okay? So when you dig one level deeper into the ecosystem, interestingly, of the 409 odd million people on the internet today, the English consuming population is 175 million only. There are 234 million regional vernacular language audiences, right? In the next 3 years, when the internet reaches a similar reach of television of close to 800 million, English will grow 1% from 175 million to 199 million. Whereas the regional language population will explode almost 3 times to nearly 600 million, which is 3/4 of the user base. Now, let's just put this into context, right? If this happens and you're a brand or a business in the room, Yes, maybe English is a language in which you're doing business, but if you're in any consumer-facing business, or in any B2B business where you have suppliers, right, where you want to deal with this vast diaspora that's coming online, what language do you think you will deal with him in, her in? English will not work, right? Till 2 years ago, pre-Geo, 2016, November, December timeframe is when Geo launched, right? Till then, there were 250 million people on the internet in India, 200 to 250 million, all were English, because it was all folks like you and me. But now, with everyone coming online, one is going to have to support local languages. Look at what some of these multinationals are doing. I don't know how many of you saw this. Amazon translated their entire app into Hindi. You think they're stupid? They wouldn't do that if there wasn't a real business. Amazon Prime yesterday launched Hindi. I was sitting with their team and they're doing Tamil, Telugu and Kannada as the next few versions. The moment Amazon does something, a whole bunch of people follow suit. PhonePe, which is the second largest UPI-based platform, supports 12 languages, right? And they're driving a large chunk of their transactions now through these languages. Again, goes back to the philosophy, people may understand English, but the comfort factor जब आप उनकी भाषा में बात करते हो, whatever that language is supreme, right? And so there's a change in mindset. Because today marketers are used to putting a Hindi ad on TV or a Tamil ad on Sun TV, right? But we're not used to putting that out on the internet. And the internet has a fallacy that you can't put an ad in Tamil and then bring him to a pure English experience. That defeats the purpose, right? Whether you're a bank or you're a securities company or you're a telco, you gotta maintain that continuous experience across language, which is what we as technologists have struggled with, but I think we have to take that leap of faith with these numbers. Now, what's gonna happen is, if you take the ad market in India, so let's contrast this with China. So 1.3 billion people in both countries. In India, the ad market is approximately $10 billion. Okay? In China, the ad market is $120 billion. Okay? That's the reality of it. Because GDP per capita in China is $8,000. Our blended GDP per capita is about $1,200, $1,200 to $1,500. So we're not a consuming nation yet. Now, those $10 billion of advertising is largely going towards that 300 million population, which is India 1 and now getting into tier 2, tier 3. A smaller chunk is towards rural. Of that 10 billion, approximately 5 billion is TV. And TV is growing, the overall ad market is growing 8%. Okay? TV is growing about 5 to 6%. Some companies are doing better at maybe 10% per growth, but I'm talking blended average of the market. Print, which is declining all over the world, in India is actually growing 1 to 2%. But digital is growing about 35%. Now, if you take the split in terms of how these markets are split, the numbers, sorry, I'll just go back. The numbers there are very interesting. So 5 billion is TV, 3 billion is print, and 2 billion is digital. But if you compound the annual growth of rate of what I'm talking, 5 billion pay 4%, 3 billion pay 1%, and 2 billion pay 35%, you'll know in the next 4 years that digital will become the dominant medium, all driven by media advertising and mobile, all happening in vernacular. And at that point of time, Google and KPMG, who've written this report, say that about 57% of all advertising on the internet will move to vernacular local languages, right? And so that becomes a very exciting opportunity. But here's some characteristics. Ye log aake kar kya rahe hain, right? And I'm saying ye log because let's say we're not one of them, right? What are they doing on the internet when they come online? So 99% of the current 234 million regional language users are accessing the internet through a mobile phone only. Interestingly, over 70% of them believe the information given to them in their regional language rather than English, even if they understand English as a second language, right? About 88% of them have higher click-through rates on advertising. So if you put an ad in English and it has a click-through rate of X, regional language is about 1.5 to 2X. They click on ads a lot more. They're spending more time. So in rural India, people are spending about 530 minutes a week, which is higher than what is there in their urban counterparts. Again, going back to the point that mobile is becoming the device for consumption. And contrary to popular belief, the moment you drive out of Bombay and go into a rural area which is connected by Jio or Airtel, the internet connectivity is far better, right? It's just that we're so congested into the areas that we are that our 4G is slow, but they're really consuming the internet in big ways, right? And 9 of 10 of everybody who's new coming online is a regional language user. 9 of 10 people, that's 90% of the base, right? And so this movement is happening. Now you got to think about which business you are in. Whichever business you are in, however you're interfacing with your clients or consumers, that interface will shift over the next 3 years, which is what Amazon's already doing, right? This is a very quick Mary Meeker report. Mary Meeker is, she publishes this report, which is like the Bible on the internet. According to her, today, the 409 million people, the time spent on mobile is 7 times that of TV. I don't know how many of you watch TV regularly now, but if you think about how much time you spent on your mobile phone versus the TV, this is true. Another fun fact, how many times do you think you lock and unlock your phone in a day? Average Indian. Yeah, you're pretty good with your estimates, yeah? But it's about 87 times. So that's a lot. That just shows you how much time we spend on the mobile phone, which is why Apple and now Android has screen time apps to kind of control the amount of screen time that we're on, right? I've talked about this slide, but essentially what is the big highlight here is digital is going to become the dominant medium for advertising. Television it's not going to go away, but it's going to become the next, and print is going to become even smaller. So if you think about the implication of what we're trying to do at Daily Hunt, our goal is very simple. We want to be the largest Bharat-focused Indic content platform, which is empowering the next billion Indians that are coming online to discover, socialize, and consume content that is informational, entertaining, and enriching. But I think we have a larger goal here, wherein as the internet pivots to local languages, our goal is to establish Daily Hunt as that credible third option to the global giants, right? I've worked for one of them. I've built their business in India. I know how cool these companies are. These are great tech companies. But when you think about this bank and this securities company, today in the digital spend, there is a duopoly. Across the world, 85 to 90% of the dollars go to Google and Facebook. And marketers will tell you this, but they yearn for a third platform. Give me a credible third platform with authentic content with real users. And I think that's what we're trying to build, to make it that made in India, for India, by Indians in local languages, to make it that largest consumption platform. Now, you may say that none of you have Daily Hunt probably on your phone. Could be, right? Frankly, I don't care about you. And I'm saying this with absolute humbleness. I care about Bharat. Because you're too small. You're already on Google and Facebook. I'm fine with that, right? You will come over time. But we care about Bharat, and that's how we're growing our user base. But just to give you a perspective of where we are, so Facebook and YouTube are around the 250, 270 million monthly active users. We are at about 157 million monthly active users already. 80% of our users come from Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4 India, rural India. And that's where the emerging Bharat is coming from. These are our numbers. The average Indian who comes onto our platform spends 27 minutes per person per day. That's higher than Facebook in India. We have over 10 billion page views in a month being consumed on the platform. Over 1 billion video views. We recently ran a poll called the Trust of the Nation poll. I don't know if anyone saw it, but there was no ad on TV, no ad on Facebook, no ad on print, no ad on the app as well. There was just a tab in the app called Trust of the Nation. And we asked 14 pretty hard-hitting questions on whether you trust the current government or you want somebody else coming in. And 5.4 million people responded to it. Now that makes it the largest pre-poll electoral independent political survey in the history of mankind. And this was done by Nielsen on our platform. What that tells you is there's an engaged audience, right? And Bharat wants to engage. They want to give out their opinions. They just don't have a mechanism or a platform yet. Take it into, I'll flip the question. How many of you are on an Instagram? And I'm looking at the women in the room because there are more percentage of women on Instagram than men. Okay, so all the women put up their hand virtually. If you think about Facebook, when I joined, we were 100 million people. When I left in 2 years, we made it the largest market in the world at 262 million people. But how many people do you think are there on Instagram in India? Guess? 60 million, 1/4. But when you look at the global numbers, Facebook took 14 years to hit 2 billion people, right? Instagram took 5 years to hit over 1 billion people, right? Now, what that tells you is why in India is that ratio 1/4? Why isn't Bharat on Instagram? How many of your drivers who drove in the car this morning with a driver are on Facebook and have got a friend request from their driver on Facebook? A lot of you, right? Are they on Instagram? No. Why? If you go and talk to them, this is the answer that I've got. I've talked to a lot of them. I've been to all parts of India. They'll tell you, boss, वो हमारे लिए नहीं है. वहाँ पे फैंसी गाड़ियाँ, फैंसी खाना, फैंसी हॉलीडेज, फैंसी होटल्स, फैंसी ड्रेसेस, वो सब है. वो भारत का कंटेंट नहीं है. So what I'm trying to tell you is that Bharat wants locally relevant content, right? And that's very, very important. I think that's the piece where 90% of our content is in local languages, right? And locally relevant, hyper-local content. This is just an interesting cut on our TG. 63% are below the age of 35. 37% are between the age of 35 and 50. 70% of them come from tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 rural India, right? Our consumption pattern of languages follows the demographics of India. English is less than 10%, Hindi 33 odd percent, and then it's Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Kannada, and of course the other regional languages. One thing that we've gotten really good at is we don't take personally identifiable information. So what we do is, using very sophisticated artificial intelligence and machine learning, we build a content graph for you by seeing what kind of content you engage on. We don't even want you to sign into the app, right? So we don't know anything about you. And so that idea about privacy is something that we're very, very careful about. But what we do know with our partnerships with cell tower and cell companies is your exact PIN code location. And so we can target you with messaging and advertising right down to the PIN code level. Just a quick sense on the numbers. So we're currently 157 million on a monthly active basis. By June, we'll be 270 million. By next year, we'll be 300 million. This is mobile, web, and app. Just the app numbers are 112 million. By June, we'll be 220 million. By the end of the year, this number will be 300 million. Because the way the media business works, and I just want to explain this to you on the internet, is it's a function of number of people and time spent. That's the only thing you care about. So just say if Jayamit was the only person on Facebook, he would spend, 10 minutes, and in 10 minutes he scrolled, let's say, 10 feet of a feed, of a length of a feed, and you put an ad after every 1 foot. And let's say I made $1 on the ad, I made $10 because Jayamit spent 10 minutes with me on Facebook, right? And so the game in the media business is get the most amount of users and get them to spend the most amount of time, right? And then you'll find ways and means of monetizing that base, where we work with partners like yourself. But this is interestingly just a quick contrast between us and Facebook, wherein the writing's on the wall, but in the last 1 year, Facebook's grown about 9 million users. We're adding 10 to 15 million new monthly active users every month, making us the fastest growing app in the country across all categories. And that's the journey that we're on, to really go down and connect Bharat. There's a lot of content in here. I won't get into this, but essentially I'll leave it on this one last note. This is what's coming in the next few days. So we're going to make the most immersive election news platform with 543 channels covering 543 constituencies in 15 different local languages. And we're really going to give you the information that matters to Bharat as we get on to this election. I think Jayamit talked about the fact that is this an election that would be won digitally or on vernacular? We truly believe that this election is going to be special for 3 reasons. And this was the Trust of the Nation poll that I was referring to. But first, it's 120 million first-time voters that are coming and voting. Second, it's the first time that the Indian elections will be watched by the entire globe. And I was much younger in those days, but in 1991, my exposure to brand CNN happened when the Iraq war happened and the Gulf War happened. And I think The Gulf War was the coming out of CNN as a brand, and I hope that the 2019 elections is the coming out of Daily Hunt as a brand. And hopefully with your support, we look forward to taking that journey forward. But thank you for the time. Thank you for having me here.